He worked in the place that erased names. Rudolf Vrba, born Walter Rosenberg, was 19 years old when he understood that Auschwitz was not a camp built for labor, but a machine built for disappearance. The transports came every day. Cattle cars stopped beside long concrete ramps. Guards divided the new arrivals with a wave of the hand. Left or right, work or smoke. Those sent to the right vanished within hours. Those sent to work were registered, tattooed, stripped of their pasts, and put to tasks that fed the system that was killing them. Vrba's job was in the Canada warehouses, the vast sorting halls where the belongings of the murdered were emptied, cleaned, and catalogued. He saw it all: the watches, gold fillings, photographs, and children's shoes. The piles were measured by tonnage, not ownership. From that vantage point, he learned the rhythm of Auschwitz better than most. He knew how long it took for a transport to arrive from Slovakia or France, how the gas chambers cycled prisoners through in shifts, and how quickly the crematoria could burn through the dead. He remembered the faces of the guards, the trucks, and the sound of the selections at night. Nearby, in another labor detachment, worked Alfréd Wetzler. Older and quieter, Wetzler had been a clerk and carried a mind for structure and order. The two men met during work shifts and began to talk, not about survival, which was nearly impossible, but about proof. Each day brought new transports, and the pattern had become a form of arithmetic. Vrba calculated that by early 1944, the killings had surpassed 1.5 million people. They realized that the destruction was not random. It followed schedules, train manifests, and quotas. Germany was running mass murder like an industrial operation, and few outside could imagine it. They also knew something else was coming. Rumors moved faster than official announcements. From new prisoners, they learned that the German and Hungarian authorities had begun concentrating Jews from the Hungarian countryside for deportation. Auschwitz's empty barracks were being cleaned and prepared. Transports from Holland and Poland had slowed. The system was clearing space. Vrba and Wetzler understood what that meant. Hundreds of thousands more were about to die. Inside Birkenau, there were ways to resist: smuggling, sabotage, prayer. But they were symbolic gestures. The guards controlled the gates, the floodlights, the dogs, and the searchlights that swept across the fences each night. Escape attempts almost always ended with bodies hanging from the wires as warnings. Still, Vrba and Wetzler began memorizing details with a precision that only men facing death could manage. Distances between blocks, the guard tower's rotation schedule, the location of the inner and outer fences, and the routines of patrol dogs. They studied the camp the way soldiers study an enemy fortress. Vrba had already tried to escape once and failed. He'd learned the importance of timing. To leave Auschwitz was not just to get over a fence, it was to pass through a layered perimeter of control. The inner camp fence charged with electricity, the outer barbed wire, the patrols with Alsatian dogs, and beyond them, villages that reported strangers to the SS. Every element was designed to ensure that the only way out was through the chimney. In early April 1944, they began their attempt. They had heard that the construction detail near the perimeter was being used to stack large timbers. Beneath one pile, they hollowed out a space just large enough for 2 bodies. They lined it with boards, collected tobacco soaked in gasoline to mask their scent from dogs, and prepared to vanish. On April 7th, after the evening roll call, they slipped from their labor group into the pile and covered themselves with boards and debris. They had nothing but a small supply of bread, margarine, and water. For 3 nights, the search went on above them. Sirens sounded. Guards and dogs scoured the compound. Shots echoed. They heard footsteps within meters of their hiding place. The dogs barked, but did not detect the scent. On the fourth night, when the noise had stopped and the floodlights shifted away, they crawled out, pressed against the ground, and moved toward the fence. The wires were still, the towers silent. They cut through the outer perimeter and disappeared into the forest. Their journey south through occupied Poland and Slovakia lasted 10 days. They moved mostly by night, drinking from ditches, hiding in haystacks, avoiding roads. Once they reached Slovak territory, they sought out sympathetic villagers and eventually reached the town of Žilina. By then, their clothes were torn, their bodies covered in lice, and their shoes in tatters. They carried nothing that could prove where they had been, only the information in their heads. The local Jewish council at first did not believe what they were hearing. Refugees arrived all the time with terrible stories, and many were contradictory. But when Vrba and Wetzler began describing the exact number of crematoria, the capacity of each furnace, and the train schedules, the council realized these men had been inside the heart of the killing operation. Over several days, in late April 1944, stenographers took down their words in Slovak and German. The result was a 33-page document that became known as the Wetzler Report, the first precise, technical account of how Auschwitz functioned. They dictated everything they had memorized: the division of the camp into Auschwitz I and Birkenau, the 4 crematoria, each with underground gas chambers capable of holding 1,000 to 2,000 people at once, the sequence of deception, undressing, gassing, and cremation, and the role of the Sonderkommando who operated the furnaces under guard. They listed SS personnel by name: Commandant Rudolf, doctors like Josef Mengele, and explained euphemisms such as special treatment, which meant death by gas. They estimated that more than 1.75 million Jews had already been murdered. Their diagrams, drawn from memory, would later prove remarkably accurate when compared with Allied aerial photographs. When they finished, Vrba said that the world would have to act now. He believed that if the Allies learned exactly how Auschwitz worked, they would bomb the rail lines, publicize the killings, and force the Germans to stop. He did not yet understand that truth and urgency do not move at the same speed. The report left Žilina and began its journey through underground networks toward Bratislava, Budapest, and Switzerland. In its tone, it was not emotional. It read like an engineer's manual. That was intentional. They knew that horror alone might be dismissed as rumor. Facts could not be argued away. They had turned the machinery of genocide into a set of coordinates and numbers, the kind that governments understood. For now, they waited in hiding, believing they had done what few could: escape from Auschwitz and deliver proof of its purpose. The rest would depend on whether anyone, anywhere, believed them in time. For the first few days after the report was completed, Vrba and Wetzler believed they had won a race against time. They were alive, and their account, the diagrams, the transport numbers, the method of killing, was being typed and duplicated by the Jewish underground in Slovakia. The men who took their words, Oskar Krasniansky and Oskar Neumann, were part of a rescue committee already trying to negotiate with German and Hungarian officials to save what remained of Central Europe's Jews. They now held, for the first time, a document that could not be dismissed as rumor. The original text was written in Slovak and German, in 33 pages, under conditions that resembled a military debriefing more than a memoir. Every fact was checked against both men's memory. When they disagreed, they debated until the details aligned. They described each building, each gas chamber, each SS officer. The report estimated that from April 1942 to April 1944, Roughly 1.75 million Jews had been murdered in Auschwitz and its satellite camps. It gave the number of transports per country, listed the arrival dates of Slovak and Polish convoys, and detailed how the Germans classified prisoners by colored triangles sewn to their uniforms. When the Žilina document was complete, it began its journey outward, carried first to Bratislava by couriers of the Jewish resistance. There, duplicates were made and smuggled toward neutral and Allied contacts. Within weeks, copies were in Switzerland, in the hands of diplomats and journalists who had spent the war hearing fragments of the Holocaust, but never such a systematic record. One copy reached the Salvadoran consulate in Geneva, where the secretary, George Mandel-Mantello, read it and immediately understood its implications. In late June 1944, he released it to Swiss newspapers and church leaders. The reaction in Switzerland was immediate and loud. Newspapers in Geneva, Zurich, and Bern printed summaries of the report under headlines that used words like extermination and industrial killing. Catholic and Protestant pastors denounced the atrocities from their pulpits. In Geneva, mass demonstrations called for an end to the deportations from Hungary, which had begun in mid-May. The outcry spread across neutral Europe. Even the Vatican and the International Red Cross were forced to respond publicly. For the first time, the name Auschwitz appeared in print as something more than rumor. But within Allied governments, the report moved slowly. Copies reached British and American diplomats through back channels, yet officials hesitated. The details seemed too precise, too vast to be real. At the same time, the War Refugee Board in Washington, established by President Roosevelt earlier that year, received its own versions and began verification. Months passed before the report was formally published on November 25, 1944, under the title German Extermination Camps, Auschwitz and Birkenau. By then, hundreds of thousands of Hungarian Jews had already been sent to their deaths. While bureaucracies debated, the Hungarian operation proceeded with mechanical efficiency. Between May 15 and July 9, 1944, more than 437,000 Jews from Hungary's provinces were deported in 147 trains to Auschwitz-Birkenau. The rail schedule mirrored the numbers Vrba and Wetzler had described. Entire towns were emptied in days. The crematoria that they had mapped burned night and day to process the influx. Their report, alive on paper, had not yet slowed the machinery it described. The breakthrough came not from governments, but from the pressure of public opinion. The Swiss campaign triggered a cascade of diplomatic protests, letters from the Vatican, telegrams from Sweden and Switzerland, and veiled threats from the Allies warning that those responsible would face justice after the war. The regent of Hungary, Admiral Miklos Horthy, under increasing pressure and aware that the war was turning against Germany, ordered the deportation stopped on July 9th. By that time, the countryside was already empty, but the Jews of Budapest, some 200,000 people, remained. Historians still debate the weight of each factor, but nearly all agree that the Wetzler Report and the publicity it inspired played a decisive role. Meanwhile, in Slovakia, Vrba and Wetzler lived under false names, moving between safe houses. They were celebrated quietly by the underground, but frustrated by the slowness of the world's reaction. Vrba, in particular, was consumed by anger. He later said that every day of delay meant thousands more lives lost. In his view, the Allied governments, the Red Cross, and even some Jewish organizations had hesitated when speed mattered most. "We escaped to warn," he would say, but the trains kept coming. The irony was that the same qualities that made their report credible, the measured tone, the technical language, also made it harder for distant readers to grasp its urgency. Officials read it as data, not as alarm. It was both a triumph of evidence and a tragedy of communication. The authors had delivered the truth, but the truth had to navigate through disbelief, politics, and fatigue before it reached action. When the War Refugee Board finally printed the English version that November, it included the diagrams and translated text, almost word for word. The cover bore the simple title, German Extermination Camps, Auschwitz and Birkenau. Distributed to governments, newspapers, and clergy, it provided the first official Allied confirmation of mass extermination in Auschwitz. For Vrba and Wetzler, now hiding in Slovakia, that publication was both vindication and a reminder of loss. By the time the world believed them, the evidence had multiplied beyond imagination. In the years that followed, historians would trace how the report moved, from a hand-typed document in Žilina to an international appeal that helped halt one of the last great deportations of the Holocaust. Its influence could not be measured in neat figures. It saved lives by changing perception, by turning the unseen into the undeniable. Yet for the men who had crawled out of Auschwitz to write it, the knowledge that belief had come too late never faded. Rudolf Vrba would later write that he escaped not to save himself, but to save others. He wanted to show that information could be a weapon. The report he and Wetzler produced remains one of the clearest early blueprints of genocide ever recorded, cold, meticulous, and irrefutable. In that sense, their escape achieved what they had set out to do. They had made the machinery of death visible to the world. Whether the world acted fast enough was another question entirely. ChatGPT said, the report began its journey through occupied Europe in late April 1944, carried not by couriers in uniform, but by men who risked death for paper. After Vrba and Wetzler dictated their testimony in Žilina, the Jewish underground in Slovakia, led by Oskar Neumann, Oskar Krasniansky, and Rabbi Michael Dov Weissmandl, typed and duplicated the 33-page document. Each copy was coded with false headers to disguise its contents from German patrols. The men knew the SS punished anyone caught with material suggesting mass murder. Even possession of a rumor could mean execution. Yet they moved it through secret channels, determined that someone, somewhere, would listen. From Žilina, it traveled south to Bratislava, where Weissmandl's working group integrated it into their broader rescue efforts. At the time, the working group was negotiating with SS officer Dieter Wisliczeny, a subordinate of Adolf Eichmann, attempting to ransom European Jews for money and trucks under the scheme known as Blood for Goods. The group hoped that concrete proof of Auschwitz's function might pressure neutral nations to intervene diplomatically. In Bratislava, several members retyped and summarized the report in German and Hungarian for transmission. Copies were then smuggled through couriers into Hungary itself, where mass deportations of Jews from the countryside had already begun. Meanwhile, another route carried the report westward into neutral Switzerland. Jewish activists and diplomats in Bratislava transmitted it through contacts in the Slovak underground, who passed it to intermediaries in the Swiss border region. By mid-June 1944, one version had reached the Salvadoran consulate in Geneva, where the secretary, George Mandel-Mantello, a Jewish businessman holding honorary diplomatic status, read it with horror. Realizing its implications, he released its contents immediately to the Swiss press and religious institutions. His decision bypassed the slow machinery of governments and censorship. The Swiss reaction was unprecedented. Within days, major newspapers such as the Journal de Genève and the Neue Zürcher Zeitung published summaries of the report. They used terms rarely printed before: gas chambers, industrial extermination, Auschwitz. Church leaders took to their pulpits. Pastor Paul Vogt in Zurich compared the killings to a modern-day Golgotha and called for action from every Christian government. Public protests followed in Bern and Geneva. For the first time, the extermination of European Jews was described in detail to a neutral public that could not be silenced by wartime censorship. Through Switzerland's telegraph and diplomatic networks, the story spread outward. The Swiss press was monitored by the Vatican, by Swedish and Turkish diplomats, and by Allied intelligence officers in London and Washington. Within weeks, excerpts of the Vrba Wetzler account were summarized in reports sent to the British Foreign Office and the U.S. War Refugee Board. By early July, the Vatican had received its own copies. Pope Pius XII's envoys sent urgent appeals to Hungary's regent, Admiral Miklós Horthy, asking him to stop the deportations. At the same time, the Swedish government and the International Red Cross issued similar protests. Inside Hungary, the pressure began to mount. Since mid-May, over 12,000 Jews a day had been deported from the provinces to Auschwitz in freight trains arranged by Adolf Eichmann's SS team and the Hungarian gendarmerie. The trains matched the schedules described in Vrba and Wetzler's testimony almost exactly. By early July, more than 437,000 had been sent to their deaths. Then the international outcry reached Budapest in full force. Radio broadcasts from London and neutral capitals reported the Swiss revelations. Leaflets circulated describing the gas chambers. Allied diplomats warned that Hungary would face post-war retribution if the killings continued. On July 9, 1944, Horthy ordered a halt to the deportations. Officially, he cited domestic reasons and Germany's deteriorating military situation, but historians agree that the convergence of the Vrba Wetzler Report, the Swiss publicity, Vatican and Swedish protests, and Allied threats created the decisive pressure. The halt saved roughly 200,000 Jews of Budapest from immediate deportation, though later attempts resumed after a German-backed coup in October. Still, the report had achieved what no military operation had managed. It had forced a moral pause in the machinery of genocide. While Europe reacted, the United States moved more slowly. The War Refugee Board, established in January 1944 by President Franklin D. Roosevelt, had been gathering evidence about Nazi atrocities but lacked direct, detailed testimony from inside the extermination camps. When versions of the Vrba Wetzler Report reached Washington through diplomatic channels in late summer, staff verified the content against other intelligence and eyewitness accounts. On November 25, 1944, the board published the English translation under the title German Extermination Camps, Auschwitz and Birkenau. The report included Vrba and Wetzler's original text, diagrams, and addenda from later escapees Jerzy Tabot, Arnošt Rosen, and Czesław Mordowicz. By that time, the Red Army was advancing toward Poland, and Auschwitz itself would be liberated within weeks. Yet the publication marked the first official Allied acknowledgement of what had been systematically denied, that Auschwitz was not a labor camp gone wrong, but the central engine of the Holocaust. Copies of the War Refugee Board report circulated to journalists, church leaders, and policymakers. It was read aloud on BBC broadcasts and used in post-war trials to corroborate survivor testimony. For Vrba and Wetzler, still hiding under false names in Slovakia, these developments reached them through whispers. They learned that the world finally knew, that Switzerland had marched, that the Vatican had spoken, and that the Allies had printed their words. But they also knew the timeline. Between their escape in April and Horthy's halt in July, more than 400,000 people had died. Every date was a calculation in their minds. Even so, their report had achieved something that armed resistance could not. It had pierced disbelief. It transformed rumor into record. The route it traveled, from a lumber pile in Auschwitz to typewriters in Slovakia, from couriers' satchels to Geneva newspapers and Allied offices, remains one of the most consequential information chains of the Second World War. It proved that truth, even delayed, can still wound the machinery of lies. When the report finally reached the desks of diplomats and policymakers, it entered a different kind of labyrinth, one built not of barbed wire, but of paper. The Vrba Wetzler testimony arrived in Switzerland in May, in Allied capitals by summer, yet disbelief and delay spread faster than truth. Officials had read rumors of atrocities before and filed them under unconfirmed intelligence. This report, though detailed and precise, seemed almost impossible to imagine. Gas chambers described as brick buildings with vents for Zyklon B pellets, crematoria processing thousands a day, trains arriving every few hours. It sounded beyond the limits of bureaucratic comprehension. In London, Foreign Office officials reviewed the early translations with caution. They had seen previous refugee accounts exaggerate numbers, and their war priorities lay elsewhere. Planning the invasion of Normandy, coordinating the Italian campaign, maintaining relations with the Soviets. Internal memoranda acknowledged that, if true, the report described mass murder on a scale without precedent. But the practical question became, what could Britain do? Bombing Auschwitz risked killing prisoners. Diverting military resources was deemed strategically unjustified. The files grew thicker while the transports continued. In Washington, the War Refugee Board, newly formed in January 1944 by executive order, received copies of the protocols in June and again in October. Staff members like Josiah Dubois and John Paley recognized the credibility of the report immediately. They cross-referenced the details with intercepted German communications and with testimonies from Polish underground couriers. But institutional inertia and chain-of-command procedures slowed any visible response. It took 5 months before the report was officially published on November 25th under the title German Extermination Camps, Auschwitz and Birkenau. By then, Auschwitz's gas chambers had already killed nearly 1.1 million people. The disbelief was not limited to governments. Within Jewish organizations, especially in neutral or occupied territories, the question was not only whether the report was true, but whether publicizing it might jeopardize ongoing rescue negotiations. In Slovakia, the working group under Rabbi Weissmandl had been trying to negotiate with the SS for halts in deportations, offering bribes and goods. When the Vrba Wetzler report arrived, its detail threatened to expose these contacts, making their clandestine efforts appear complicit. Some leaders feared that publicizing the report would provoke German retaliation or end all chance of bargaining. Rudolf Vrba, who had risked everything to escape and tell the world, never forgave that hesitation. He later said that every day of silence cost thousands of lives. His memoir and interviews decades later echoed the same bitterness, that officials debated while trains moved, that the truth had to fight for attention in a world already drowning in war. To him, the Allied refusal to bomb Auschwitz's rail lines or crematoria was not a military calculation, but a moral failure. Inside the Vatican, the report's path followed a quieter route. Copies sent from Switzerland reached the Secretariat of State in late June 1944. Papal diplomats had already been receiving fragmented reports from Poland and Slovakia about mass killings. After reading the Vrba Wetzler testimony, Vatican representatives drafted appeals to Hungary's Regent Horthy and to the German ambassador in Rome. On June 25, 1944, the Vatican radio broadcast a message condemning massacres of innocent peoples. Yet the statement never mentioned Jews or Auschwitz by name. The Church's response was real but cautious, shaped by its political neutrality and fear of German reprisals in occupied Italy. Among Allied military planners, the issue of bombing Auschwitz became a contested point. In August 1944, the U.S. War Department reviewed proposals from Jewish leaders and the War Refugee Board to target the rail lines leading to the camp or the crematoria themselves. The Air Force rejected them, claiming that bombers were needed for decisive military objectives. Ironically, reconnaissance flights had already photographed Auschwitz while striking oil refineries nearby at Monowitz. The images showing rows of barracks and crematoria were later used as post-war evidence, but at the time, they were simply archived. In the months that followed, the Auschwitz Protocols circulated through military and diplomatic networks, but their impact came too late for most of Hungary's Jews. By the time Horthy ordered the deportations halted on July 9, 1944, almost all provincial Jewish communities had already been destroyed. What remained was Budapest, spared temporarily until the German-backed Arrow Cross coup later that autumn reignited the killings. The report had achieved a moral victory. It had pierced the wall of disbelief. But the bureaucracy of the world had moved too slowly to turn it into immediate action. After the war, when the world saw the photographs from the liberated camps, the Vrba Wetzler Report was recognized as one of the earliest and most accurate eyewitness accounts of the Holocaust. Its authors had documented everything months before Allied armies set foot in Poland: the gas chambers, the crematoria, the selection process, the industrial rhythm of death. Yet the men who wrote it carried their own judgment about what the world did with that knowledge. Vrba would later testify at war crimes trials and appear in documentaries, still insisting that belief came too late. Wetzler, quieter, returned to Slovakia and lived in obscurity, writing under a pseudonym. The report they created remains a mirror, showing both the courage of those who spoke and the hesitation of those who listened. In the end, disbelief was not only an emotional response, but a systemic one, a world conditioned by war bureaucracy, by layers of verification, by political caution that filtered out urgency. The Vrba Wetzler Report forced those systems to confront something beyond strategy, the limits of human imagination in the face of mechanized atrocity. And even as the world failed to act in time, their voices ensured that the record existed, undeniable before the ashes cooled. When the war finally ended, the world began uncovering proof of everything Rudolf Vrba and Alfréd Wetzler had risked their lives to describe. Soviet troops liberated Auschwitz on January 27, 1945, and what they found matched the escapees' words almost line for line. The 4 crematoria stood in ruins, but recognizably identical to the diagrams in the protocols. Piles of human hair, mountains of shoes, abandoned ledgers of train arrivals. All the physical confirmations of what had been dictated months earlier in a safe house in Žilina. Investigators gathered the documents, blueprints, and testimony that would soon reach Nuremberg. Among them sat the Vrba Wetzler Report, now officially translated and filed by the War Refugee Board under the title German Extermination Camps, Auschwitz and Birkenau. Prosecutors cited it to prove premeditation, that Auschwitz wasn't chaos but design. For historians and jurists, it became one of the earliest comprehensive eyewitness accounts of the Holocaust, drafted while the killing still occurred. Yet for the men who wrote it, vindication was a hollow victory. Vrba later said that every confirmation he read felt like a delayed echo. The world had believed him, but only after belief no longer saved lives. Still, his report accomplished what no rumor or leaflet could. It broke the wall of denial that surrounded Auschwitz before liberation. For that reason alone, it became a cornerstone of historical truth. Vrba rebuilt his life in fragments. After the war, he emigrated to London, then Israel, and finally Canada, where he taught biochemistry at the University of British Columbia. He never stopped lecturing about Auschwitz, refusing to let memory dissolve into abstraction. In interviews, his sentences blended science and survival, precise, clinical, unwilling to soften reality. "I wanted to show," he said, "that knowledge can be resistance." Wetzler returned to Czechoslovakia, living under the name Józef Lanik. In 1964, he published a novelized account, What Dante Did Not See, embedding his memories in fiction because direct testimony was still politically restricted under communist rule. He lived quietly until his death in 1988, his authorship of the protocols acknowledged only later. By the 1960s, historians began to connect their report with a chain of decisions that shaped the war's final year. The Auschwitz Protocols were now recognized as a turning point in the world's understanding of industrialized murder. The text entered archives at Yad Vashem, the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum, and the FDR Library in Hyde Park. Each copy bore the same dry government header, but its content remained alive. 33 handwritten pages that had traveled from a barbed wire hell to the desks of diplomats, priests, and generals. In the decades that followed, scholars estimated that roughly 200,000 Hungarian Jews, most from Budapest, survived because the report, once publicized in Switzerland, provoked an international outcry strong enough to pressure Regent Horthy to halt deportations. The causal links would always be debated, but the timing was undeniable. Vrba's bitterness never faded, yet even he acknowledged that his warning, though late, had still saved lives. The report's legacy reached beyond archives. It changed how nations remembered atrocity itself, as something documented while still unfolding. It proved that resistance could take the form of precision, names, numbers, sketches, times. In later interviews, Vrba called that his form of revenge, not bullets, but evidence. In the spring of 1944, while Rudolf Vrba and Alfréd Wetzler were still walking through the forests of Slovakia, the last stage of the Holocaust was already unfolding in Hungary. Germany had occupied its ally that March, sending Adolf Eichmann's special detachment to solve what remained of Europe's Jewish question. Within weeks, the country became the site of the fastest mass deportation in history. Trains left almost every day from provincial towns, Munkacs, Szeged, Debrecen, Kassa, each packed with thousands of people who had been told they were being resettled for work. The reality was industrial killing. Between mid-May and early July 1944, about 437,000 Hungarian Jews were sent to Auschwitz-Birkenau in just 56 days. Nearly all were murdered on arrival. To the SS, it was efficiency. To the victims, it was annihilation at railway speed. At that same moment, in Žilina, Vrba and Wetzler finished dictating their 30-page report describing Auschwitz in forensic detail, maps of the camp, diagrams of the gas chambers, the rhythm of transports, the routine of deception. Copies were typed and smuggled through underground Jewish channels into Bratislava and then across the border into neutral Switzerland. In Geneva, a Salvadoran consulate secretary named George Mandel-Mantello received one of the first full translations. Horrified, he gave it to Swiss journalists and Protestant clergy. The reaction was immediate. Leading newspapers such as Neue Zürcher Zeitung, Basler Nachrichten, and Journal de Genève began publishing excerpts that spoke of gas chambers, crematoria, and daily convoys of thousands. Swiss pastors like Paul Vogt preached from their pulpits, declaring silence itself a crime. In churches across Switzerland, bells rang for the condemned. From there, outrage traveled fast. The Vatican sent appeals through diplomatic channels. Pope Pius XII urged Regent Miklos Horthy to stop the deportations. In London and Washington, telegrams followed from Churchill and Roosevelt warning Hungary that those responsible for mass murder would be held personally accountable. The combined moral pressure struck Budapest just as the last provincial transports were being loaded. On July 7, 1944, Horthy ordered the deportations halted. His motives were mixed, part conscience, part calculation as the war turned against Germany. But the timing left no doubt that the international outcry, triggered by the Swiss release of the Vrba Wetzler Report, had forced his hand. For the first time in months, the railways to Auschwitz fell silent. About 200,000 Jews in Budapest remained alive. During that pause, neutral diplomats used the breathing space to act. Raoul Wallenberg of Sweden, Karl Lutz of Switzerland, and Angel Sans-Britz of Spain began issuing thousands of protective passports and safe conduct letters. Their work, backed by the information that had reached the world through Vrba and Wetzler's testimony, saved tens of thousands. The halt did not last. In October, when German forces installed the fascist Arrow Cross regime, shootings resumed along the Danube and death marches began toward Austria. Yet without that July suspension, Budapest's Jewish population might have vanished entirely. Historians still debate whether Horthy acted out of fear of Allied retaliation or from moral pressure, but all agree on one fact. The Vrba Wetzler Report turned information into action. It transformed distant rumor into verifiable proof, forcing neutral nations, churches, and governments to respond. By the time the U.S. War Refugee Board officially published German extermination camps, Auschwitz and Birkenau, that November, the killing at Auschwitz was winding down. The crematoria would be dismantled weeks later as the Red Army advanced. Vrba believed the response had come too late, yet even he acknowledged that his warning had broken through the wall of disbelief that surrounded the camps. Hungary's fate remains the clearest example of how two men's testimony, carried across mountains and borders, managed to slow a genocide. The report did not end the Holocaust, but it altered its final chapter. Proof that even in history's darkest machinery, words could still jam the gears. By the end of 1944, the killing machine that had consumed Europe was collapsing under its own weight. The Red Army was pushing west, the Reich was retreating, and Auschwitz itself, once the center of that machinery, was being dismantled. Yet the words of Rudolf Vrba and Alfréd Wetzler continued to move. Their report, first whispered through underground networks and then printed by governments, had crossed from witness testimony into global record. In November, the War Refugee Board in Washington released its English-language publication, German Extermination Camps, Auschwitz and Birkenau. It was a slim document, 33 pages of tight type, issued quietly amid headlines of battles and bombings. But for those who read it, it was unlike anything seen before. Inside were the names of SS officers, the measurements of the gas chambers, the capacity of the crematoria, and the schedules of trains. It was evidence written while the crime still existed. Diplomats forwarded copies to the United Nations War Crimes Commission. Clergy used it in sermons. Journalists quoted it as the first undeniable blueprint of organized mass murder. In the months that followed, as Allied troops liberated camps across Poland and Germany, the Vrba Wetzler Report became a measuring stick for every discovery. Reporters who entered Buchenwald, Dachau, and Bergen-Belsen recognized in those places the same logic described months earlier, the same language of dehumanization made mechanical. After the war, their report became a cornerstone of post-war justice. At Nuremberg, prosecutors used it to demonstrate that the extermination was premeditated, bureaucratically planned, and known to high-ranking officials long before the war's end. The diagrams Vrba and Wetzler had drawn from memory match the blueprints found in SS archives. Their estimates of transports aligned almost exactly with surviving railway records. What had once been dismissed as unbelievable became the factual spine of genocide prosecution. But the men themselves were not celebrated. For decades, their names appeared only in footnotes. Vrba, restless and outspoken, refused to let the story fade into comfortable memory. In every interview, he repeated the same theme, that truth was available long before the world chose to see it. His tone was analytical, never sentimental. "I did not escape to save myself," he said. "I escaped to warn." Alfréd Wetzler lived quietly, never seeking recognition. Under his pen name, Josef Lanik, he wrote about what he called the geography of evil, how ordinary places, through obedience and design, became instruments of extinction. His book, What Dante Did Not See, was banned in several Eastern Bloc countries for its open criticism of totalitarian systems, but it circulated underground until his death in 1988. Only in the late 20th century did their act receive the attention it deserved. Scholars revisited the Auschwitz Protocols, tracing how the escape and the report changed the tempo of global awareness in 1944. Survivors from Hungary testified that news of the deportations and the Swiss press campaign had reached them just before the roundup stopped. Their words confirmed what Vrba had long insisted: that information, when believed, could save lives. Today, the Vrba-Wetzler Report sits in museums and archives across the world, at Yad Vashem, in the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum, and in the FDR Presidential Library. Each copy is identical to the first: maps, tables, eyewitness precision. Historians still debate how many lives their warning saved, but no one doubts what it proved: that two prisoners, armed only with knowledge, cracked open one of the best-kept secrets of the Third Reich. In the decades that followed, Vrba often reflected on what he called the second death of the victims, the moment when people stop remembering why they died. He spoke not with bitterness, but with the weary logic of a scientist. "Facts," he said, "are not enough. They must be believed in time to matter." His life became a lesson in how truth and delay can coexist, how civilization can witness evidence and still hesitate. When he died in 2006, aged 81, tributes called him the man who escaped hell to tell the world what hell looked like. Wetzler's name followed soon after, his quiet legacy bound to Vrba's forever. Their footsteps, their dictated pages, their lines of numbers became the echo that outlived the war. The report they carried through mud and fear did more than describe death. It redefined how humanity records it. It forced the world to confront a question that still hangs over every era that follows: how many warnings must be given before the truth is believed?